Hello everybody. Today I'm going to start a new project, and it's my autobiography. I've thought about writing it. In fact, I have actually made a start, but I think in this day and age, with the ease of making personal videos, that this would probably be an easier way of doing it and an easier way of making it available to more people free of charge. So here we go. Chapter 1, the autobiography of Cozmicjake, aka Peter Johnston. It all started just after the war, and my mother and father were reunited. My father was away for most of the war, and as a result of this unification, I was conceived. My father later told me that it was largely due to the fact that it was not possible to get good quality condoms at the end of the war, and so an ill wind and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, towards the end of 1946, it was obvious that I was imminent, and my mother, who at that time was actually externalizing her spirituality, had decided that I was to be born in what nowadays would be called a New Age maternity home. It was a holistic maternity home situated in the area of London known as Blackheath. Now, towards the end of November in 1946, it was a particularly severe winter, and the weather was foggy and frosty, and the roads were icy, and gasoline, or petrol as we call it, was in short supply and heavily rationed. And we were living on the south coast of England in a little town called Gosport on the west side of Portsmouth Harbour, Portsmouth being the big naval base, and we were there because my father was a naval officer. In fact, he was a surgeon in the Royal Navy and was attached to Haslar Hospital in Gosport, which was a huge naval hospital that had been serving the British Navy since Napoleonic times, I believe. And anyway, it was apparent on this cold and frosty day at the end of November 1946 that I was imminent. And so my mother said to my father, "Okay, we have to go. We're going to go up to London, as you know, and let's go." And my father, who of course was practical man, said, "Well, do we really have to go up to London? Why don't we just go to the hospital down the road, of which he was attached to, and get it over with there with the least possible fuss and difficulty for everyone?" And my mother said, "No, absolutely not. I insist that this child be born in a holistic Dr. Pink's holistic nursing home, Blackheath in London." Anyway, so my father, being a dutiful husband, went out and tried to start the car, and as is the wont of a lot of British cars of that vintage, when the weather is bad and damp and all that kind of thing, it refused to start. So my father said, "Well, not a problem. We'll get you down to Haslar and we'll get this whole thing dealt with in a sensible manner." But my mother was determined, and she said, No, absolutely not. I am going to have this child in Dr. Pink's nursing home, so you, as a naval officer, should summon a naval staff car with a driver, and we will proceed to London that way. So, of course, half an hour later, a big blue naval Humber turned up with a Wren, that's a female sailor basically, driver, to convey us to South London, and off we set. Well, we'd gone less than 10 miles, and that big blue naval Humber broke down, and the journey was stopped. So my father at this point said, "Well, now let's do the right thing and go to Haslar Hospital and stop this nonsense of driving 75 miles in this abominable weather." And okay, Well, my mother was, as I said, determined, and she said, no, absolutely not. Order a taxi. Now, one has to realize that in 1946, even today, taking a taxi 75 miles is not common. And in 1946, it was an extraordinary idea. As I say, especially as gasoline was heavily rationed and it was not easily available, which meant that the cost would be quite considerable, to say the least. But anyway, my mother was being determined, and my father being a dutiful husband. A taxi was summoned, and in due course a taxi driven by a charming gentleman called Mr. Urry showed up, and all three and a half of us, me being the half, set off for London. And progress was slow, the roads were foggy, and there was no highways or motorways as we call them in Britain. And so basically we drove up fairly small, probably mainly two-lane blacktop roadways to London in bad conditions, in probably not a very modern car, even at the time. And so most of the day was spent driving to London. And my mother was by this time starting to have contractions, so it was touch and go. Surprisingly, when we got near to South London, instead of pushing on relentlessly, my father realized that we were just about to pass the Keppel's Head Hotel, which was a hotel that he particularly liked because they had a nice bar and a nice menu. And so instead of continuing directly on to Dr. Pink's, my father suggested that we all, stop for dinner at the Keppel's Head and have a plateful of scampi and probably a couple of whiskies as well. Well, anyway, Mr. Urry, the driver, thought this was a good idea, so they did stop. They turned off the A3 into the parking lot of Keppel's Head, and whereby the two men got out and proceeded into the hotel, while my mother, very sensibly, I think, in the circumstances, said no, she wouldn't join them. She would remain seated in the car and try to prevent herself from giving birth in the back seat of a taxi. Anyway, the two men spent an hour or so in the hotel and then came back out in a good mood, and I'm not sure what the mood of my mother was at that time, but one can well imagine. And they completed the journey to Dr. Pink's nursing home in south-east London, and apparently only 20 or so minutes after our arrival, I did in fact appear on the scene, and that's how I arrived on this planet. That's how I made my entrance. Well, I think my mother's decision to have me have the birth at Dr. Pink's was a good one, because she stayed there for a month, so I've been told, and had a very relaxing, very nice time being looked after by people who were sympathetic to her needs and her spiritual requirements. And so she had a nice holiday, as it were, with me and, of course, several other women who were in a similar situation. One footnote to this is that apparently I was a greedy little fellow and showed an inclination to consume more milk than my mother was producing, so I used to get handed round the various other mothers, some of which who had more milk than their offspring actually required. So I think that was rather an interesting point that possibly shaped some of my tastes later in life. Anyway, enough said on that score, but that's how I arrived on planet Earth, and after the month or so, my mother and I returned to Gosport, and our lives continued. The next period that I remember, inasmuch as I was conscious of being alive and accumulating memories, was not until I was 3.5 years old, and I will continue at that point in my next little account at the beginning of the autobiography of Cozmicjake. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.